Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to a Valley Beth Shalom program, Uprising in Iran, a community briefing featuring Dr. Soomekh, who we welcome to our community this evening. I just wanted to offer a few words of Torah before we begin, because I think the Torah always speaks to the moment in which we live. I don't think that it's a coincidence that we're facing this as we transition from Parshat Breshit to Parshat Noach. Breshit is a parsha, the beginning of the Torah, full of promise and possibility of all of the goodness in the world. And very quickly in the Torah, the world devolves into chaos and ugliness and violence. The Torah uses the word Hamas in Hebrew to discuss the kind of lawless violence, which is apropos this evening, since Hamas is a proxy of this Iranian regime that we're going to be speaking about for this evening, threatening the Jewish people. So we live in this moment now. We live in this moment in which a regime has threatened status quo, threatened peace, threatened human rights for so long. And now we live in this moment of possibility once again, right? The flood comes and wipes away all of the violence and gives us another chance at promise. And I think that that kind of hopefulness and that kind of anguish at the same time, as we see what's happening to the protesters, we know from the Torah that change does not come overnight. The flood didn't happen in a moment to wipe away all of Hamas. And we're hopeful. We sit here as a community in each other's arms, hopeful in the fact that there could be a better tomorrow for not only the people struggling in Iran for human rights, the young people in the streets, the people put in prison, the people being arrested every single day, but all of humanity. And with that, I want to welcome my partner in crime this evening, Cantor Jacqueline Rafii, who will introduce Dr. Soomekh.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lebovitz, Yasher Koach, and Amen. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Saba Soomekh joining us this evening. She is the Director of Training and Education at the American Jewish Committee. She's also a lecturer at the Academy for Jewish Religion, California, my alma mater. And I had the great privilege to study with Dr. Soomekh at AJRCA and at UCLA, where she's also has been a lecturer of various subjects. At AJRCA, she teaches religious studies and Middle Eastern history courses. Dr. Soomekh received her BA in religious studies from Berkeley and her master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, and her PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She teaches and writes extensively on world religions, on women and religion, intersectionality, its impact on the Jewish community, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. She's also very active in interreligious and intercultural dialogue, and she's been recognized with distinction for her amazing work in that area. In the summer of 2019, she was a scholar in residence at Oxford University with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. She is also an accomplished author. She's written the book Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in America, as well as the book From the Shahs to Los Angeles, 3 Generations of Iranian Jewish Women Between Religion and Culture. That is an incredible book that I read not only when I was her student at UCLA as an undergrad, but also used it as a basis for my master's thesis, and just an incredible book, both incredible books. She was awarded the gold medal in the Independent Publisher Book Award in the religion category for Shahs of Los Angeles, and she also coordinated the exhibit Light and Shadows, the Story of Iranian Jews at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. She's been featured in a documentary on PBS. She's been featured in NPR Story and has had articles written about her in the Times of Israel. And we are just so delighted that in her busy schedule, you have made time to join us this evening and share your expertise with us. And I just want to also add that Dr. Soomekh is a personal friend, someone that I admire and adore and have known for many years. And she was the reader for my thesis. What an honor. And I'm just so thrilled that you joined us. And we are delighted, Rabbi Lebovitz and I and our whole VBS community are really delighted to have you. So, Dr. Soomekh.
Thank you so much. I know I'm not supposed to say this, but Jackie, you know you're my favorite. You have been since undergrad, and that's all I'll say because I don't want to turn this into a gush fest. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Rabbi Lebovitz. Thank you all for spending your evening with me. I know you didn't come here to hear me speak about anything except Iran, so let's get to it because I really want to make sure we get to your questions and answers. What I will do is I'll go through the slide deck. If you have any questions, please post them so you don't forget. And then I think Jackie will be moderating those questions, and hopefully we'll have some good time to address them and really get to the nitty gritty. So let me share my screen with all of you. Okay, Iran, this uprising in Iran, what's going on? And I know everyone's watching the news and wondering what in the world can we do about it? And I don't really know if I have the best answers because a lot of people don't have the best answers. So this uprising is known from this context of that we're seeing it all over the world. Women, life, and freedom. What is being written in Iran, what is being chanted. And it is a women's movement, but it is more than a women's movement because it's not just about the hijab or the chador wearing the headscarf. That is a metaphor for everything that is taking place in Iran and has been taking place since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And as we know, as I write a lot about, it's always women. You could look at the way women are being treated and their rights and their lack of human rights, and that gives you a good example of what's going on in the country and the direction it's going. So we have a picture, of course, of Mahsa. She is the woman that we'll talk about that really jump-started all of this. And it's not uncommon as a historian of the Middle East to look at one person who could jumpstart all of this. It took one person in North Africa to set himself on fire to basically spread the Arab Spring. And this took this one woman, unfortunately, who was murdered for showing some hair to start this movement. Today is 40 days since she has passed away, since she was murdered by the Basij, the Islamic regime. And we'll talk about what that regime is and what the Basij is. And this picture over here is a picture of tens of thousands of people attending the 40-day commemoration in her Kurdish town, where people were, again, of course, not surprisingly, beaten up, arrested, etc. Men, women, old, young, religious, not religious. So it really shows how significant she was and is and what her death meant. Okay, so what are the protests about? It started with the death of Mahsa Amini. She is not from Tehran. She came from a Kurdish province. The Kurds do not have their own country, and they are living in Iran. They're living in Iraq, and they basically got jacked out of a country when the Sykes-Picot Treaty happened and are constantly being persecuted. She and her family come to visit Tehran. She shows a couple of wisps of hair, which, by the way, today in Iran, that's not that big of a deal because a lot of women are pushing that boundaries with that. The morality police come and get her, and they separate her from her family. This happens all the time to women. And her family can't find her. They don't know where she is. The next thing they know, she's in a coma. And the next thing they know is she is dead. The Iranian regime puts out this video. And remember, there's no freedom of press in Iran. Every single thing that comes out in the newspaper, in the radio, on TV is all government sponsored. And they show this video in which she collapses at the police station, wherever they took her, and they claim that she had a heart attack, etc. She was in her 20s. So the chances of her having a heart attack when she's never had any heart problems was ridiculous. So everyone knew exactly what was going on. And there was images of her in a coma, and I was going to put it up, and I thought I'm not going to do that. It just enraged ordinary Iranians. And so what happened was, first the protest took place in the western city of Sakhez, which is where the Kurds are. And women started taking off their headscarves in solidarity, which seems like it's not a big deal, but under the Islamic regime, as we know, it is a big deal. And what is so significant about this protest, and what we'll talk about why this is so different than the other ones that have taken place, is that it has swelled. And it is not only about taking off the hijab. It's not an economic protest. It's not, I want the right to vote, 2009 Green Revolution protest. It is legitimately now to overthrow the Islamic regime. And we have not seen that really since 1979. So what are the women doing? They're taking off their headscarves. They're cutting their hair in public, something that seems so trivial in the West, which means so much to people who live under Islamic rule. Now, again, this is not about putting on the headscarf, taking off the headscarf. As we are seeing, it's even religious women who are coming and showing support. The whole aspect of it is bodily autonomy, which is also a bigger aspect of women's rights in Iran because they're seen as second-class citizens, which then goes into just human rights violations in Iran. So again, chanting women, life, freedom, but this is a huge thing that they're chanting. Death to the dictator. Again, we didn't see this before since 1979, the idea that they want a regime change. So it has unprecedented show of support from women from all economic classes, religiosity, schoolgirls. And what also makes this so important is that it's not just women, but as we've seen, it's a lot of men who are showing up. By the way, something like 70% of the population is under the age of 35 in Iran. Why? Because when Khomeini came into power, by 1979, by 1980 to 1988, you had the Iran-Iraq war. And what did Khomeini do? Again, he politicized women's bodies and he took women out of the job force and said, if you're going to be good Shia women, you need to have lots of children. Why? Because at 12 years old, these boys were being sent off into the Iraq war to have their bodies blow up. And then the Iranian army would come in and their mothers would get a plastic key, which was their ticket to heaven, their children's ticket to heaven. So what did he do? He politicized women's bodies, have babies as martyrs for the revolution. And they did. And now all these people are under the age of 35 with horrible economic situations and really repressed. And with the difference between, let's say, their generation and the other prior generations is internet. They have the internet. They know what's out there. They're very tech savvy. And they're also very educated. Over 70% of the universities are with women. 70% with women. In fact, more women became educated under Ayatollah Khomeini than they did under the Shah. Not because the Shah, who was secular, did not force women to go to school, but because so many of the fathers were religious, and under the secular regime of the Pahlavis, boys and girls sat together. A lot of people didn't send their girls to school. But then when Khomeini came in, separated the gender, put the headscarf and the hijab and the chador and all these rules in, then the religious people felt like they could send their kids to school. And now what we see is in the university, 70% are women. So I just want to show some images of what we were seeing. And I know a lot of people see these. So we have had freedom, Iran rallies all over the world, Berlin, all over Europe, of course, LA, which has one of the largest expat communities, women cutting their hair as a symbolism. And I mean, you got to look at the picture on the far right, because these schoolgirls could have been murdered for this, taking off their chador, their headscarf. And by the way, the chador is the Persian way of basically saying the hijab, which is Arabic, and giving the finger to Khomeini. And that's a really, really big deal. The picture on the bottom is Tehran. And it's not just flooded with women, but flooded with men, old, young, etc. And then, of course, we have this beautiful young woman who went missing 2 weeks ago, I think 18 years old. And she's one of many whose parents, her body was returned with her skull smashed in. And that's one of many women that this is happening to, men and women, during this revolution. As I said, today is a 40-day commemoration in Shia Islam. 40 days is, just like in most religious traditions, auspicious, where you go to the tomb, and you had tens of thousands of people who went to commemorate Mahsa's death. And then, of course, you had the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij there, who was just beating them up. And then, of course, what did the government do? Was they shut down the internet, so no one could see any images of what was going on. And that's become a huge issue there. Now, when we were looking at women in Iran, the history of women's resistance in Iran is not new. And it's actually, there's this, again, I write about women in the Middle East, this idea that women are just relegated to the domestic sphere. They're quiet, they're helpless. And in some countries, it is like that because of the rules and regulations. But we have had a history of women's resistance in Iran. when we look at the Islamic Revolution, it was not just religious people who wanted Ayatollah Khomeini to come into power. It was the secularists, it was communists, it was socialists, it was educated people. And Khomeini kind of introduced himself as kind of this Che Guevara kind of figure. He didn't introduce himself and present himself as this Islamic cleric, even though he was. And the Pahlavi regime, the secular regime, if for religious minorities was great, but for a lot of people, if you weren't that wealthy couple of 1%, you were the have-nots and you were looking at them living this very gluttonous, lovely life, and you felt like you couldn't be a part of that. So the irony is that the Shah sent all of these young men and women, if their parents were, what we say, Roshan Frek, more enlightened, abroad to Europe or to America, to LA to study, and then come back to Iran to, build up the economy. But what did these young secular guys see? A democracy, and they came back and they wanted that. And they falsely assumed that Khomeini was a person who was going to give it to them. And then Khomeini comes into power. And quickly people realized who he actually was. And he turned the country into a theocracy, a fake democracy based on theology. And all the secular people that supported him were either imprisoned, were killed. And that was including a lot of women. So he comes in and says, now every woman has to wear the hijab. And women said, wait, these are women who voted for him, who supported him. And the irony, and we could talk about this in the question and answer, why do they support him over the Shah? We could talk about that later. But March 7th, he announced that. And literally the very next day on International Women's Day, tens of thousands of unveiled women marched in protest. And you had thousands of men there literally beating them up because of that. And what we see is that this isn't new. Since the 19th century, Iranian women have been protesting mandatory veiling through different Shia regimes that were in Iran. And it was in 1935 that the secular regime of the Pahlavis, Reza Pahlavi, made it illegal for women to veil. So you really see women's bodies constantly being used by the different kings, the different shahs, in order to justify their politics. And veiling was always an issue in Iran. A century ago, strict veiling was really only limited to Iran's upper classes. If you were a woman working in the rural areas, you didn't veil. You maybe wore a very modest, headscarf with your hair showing because you were out in the field. So veiling has always been a thing. And through the 19th century, women have always been front and center in street protests. So in 1905, Iran went through its attempt to have a democratic uprising and a constitutional revolution in 1906. And many women went into the streets in towns and cities and formed women's rights committees in order to be able to have the 1906 democracy. And during the Islamic Revolution, women wearing the hijab became a symbol of people who did not support the Shah and supported Khomeini. So these are just images of women pre-79. So this would be Jackie's mom. This would be my mom going to Tehran University, going to Madrasa Ettifaq, which is a Jewish day school. You felt like, as they said, that in all of my interviews for my first book, that all the women said they felt like they were living on a cloud, wearing mini skirts, going to Tehran University, getting jobs, going to discos, dancing. Iran at that time had a great relationship with Israel. So they felt like, life is great. Look at this Leonard, which my dad used to wear this cologne, this ad from Europe. And it just shows you, this is what the billboards were all over Iran, which are, women dress, European billboards. No one thought twice about it. These are images of women and the rally on March 8th going against Ayatollah Khomeini. Many said they didn't even own a hijab. They didn't even look at a hijab. And these are women from all different religious backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. But then look at the fight that starts taking place. You could see this in their faces between the secular women and the religious women who were very happy that this was happening. And what did Khomeini do? He turned to the religious women and said, for decades under the Pahlavi regime, you were told that you were backwards because you're religious. You were told, you are, in the Farsi, the word is dahati, ghetto, not important. Well, now we're going to give you the arms that America gave to to the Shah, and the Shah's army dropped them and bailed. And now you are the morality police. And now you go around, and if a woman shows a piece of hair, if she has lipstick on, if she has nail polish on, you have the right to put her into a truck, hit her, whip her, have her disappear. And this is basically what happened. Now, let's go back to Massa and what has happened. So how have the authorities, how has Khomeini and his people reacted? Number one, which is not new for anyone, he blamed Israel and the United States. He first played down the protest. Then he sent in the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij to suppress the protests and kill protesters. They shut down the internet and silenced independent media. At this point, we know that there's about 50 journalists who have been arrested so far just in the past 40 days, and about 40 of them are women. So it's not only independent media, but a lot of people are just taking it upon themselves to be journalists and try to get what's going on out. But it's hard because the internet is shut down. They've arrested journalists, as we've talked about. And this is a thing. And Rabbi Lebovitz, you talked about Hamas being a proxy of Iran. So is Hezbollah. And so are the Shias in Iraq. And Iran has brought in these armed proxies to kill and to torture the protesters. And it's easier to bring in people from the outside because they have no emotion. They don't have a stake in this. So they have been really, really brutal. And their fear is, the Iranian government's fear is that the Basij or anyone else is going to start having any type of emotion about what's going on and turn around and say, I don't want to arrest these people, or I don't want to, take in what they're also doing to the women, because under Shia rule, you cannot kill a virgin. A lot of times they're taking them to jail, raping them, and then torturing them and killing these women. So how many people have been killed? It's really, really hard to know these numbers. We're actually having a really hard time getting some of this out there. We don't know. We know, according to Amnesty International, which I don't love for a lot of reasons, but with this context, I'll look at their numbers, that at least more than 23 children have been killed, because the protests have not only been taken into the streets, it's not only in the universities, but we're seeing them in schools, as I showed you these young pictures of these 13, 14-year-old girls. So 23 have been killed. The Minister of Education have said that these children are being taken to psychological centers, and we have no idea what's taking place in these psychological centers and what they're doing to them. We are seeing human rights workers, journalists, students, lawyers, opposition environmentalists. All of them are being held in Ivan prison. Ivan prison was started by the Pahlavi regime. And while there might have been thousands of people under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Ivan prison, when Khomeini came in, tens of thousands. Until this day, it's considered this intellectual prison. Why? Because all of the top intellects who oppose the regime are now imprisoned there. And we know a fire broke out on October 15th, and we are not getting any information over how many people were killed, who were killed, what happened. We know about, according to Amnesty, about 6,000 people have been detained in the past 40 days, and over 250 people have been killed. But again, we can't verify those numbers. I'm sure they're higher than what we are told or what we are seeing. So who's killing them? It's the Basij. So who is the Basij? Where do they even come from? So the Basij was started by Ayatollah Khomeini in 79. They didn't exist before. And it's a branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the army. And the Revolutionary Guard was designated a terrorist organization by the United States in 2019. So Basij in Farsi literally means mobilization or militia. So who are these guys? They're a bunch of young religious men coming from families in the countryside, mostly with no money. And they have been recruited by the Islamic regime to basically say, do whatever you need to do in order to get people to stop protesting, to stop working against the government, etc. For these young men, this is the only way they can make money and send it back to their families, and the only way that they're able to get upward mobility, somewhat upward mobility. Let's see what else I could tell you about them. So what do they do? They literally run around the country imposing strict religious codes. They act as a morality police for both men and women. If you see a man and a woman, sitting together, walking together, and they're not married, they take them both in. They literally go to parks, concerts, restaurants, checkpoints, and they heavily monitor the population. They patrol the streets. And what they're seeing now is that the members are dressing in plain clothes to infiltrate the protest, and then put political activists in ambulances, which then they're taken to prison and tortured. So we have seen them whipping, using batons, and of course, using guns to kill the demonstrators. And this is an image from April of the Besiege. Okay, how is this protest different than all the other protests that we've seen? Let's look at the 2009 Green Revolution. For those who aren't familiar with that protest took place because the way Iran works is that it's a theocracy. The Ayatollah decides who becomes the president. So you're voting, but if he doesn't like who you're voting for, your vote doesn't matter. And so the youth wanted Mossavi, a reformist president. The Ayatollah wanted Ahmadinejad, and they claimed that Ahmadinejad won. So basically you had this unrest. But what you saw was, the numbers were there. You had hundreds of thousands of people. This country has 80 million plus people. Hundreds of thousands of people go into the streets. But what were they saying? They weren't saying we want a regime change. What they were saying was we want our vote to count. And the people that were doing it tend to be upper middle class, educated, young, and coming from the cities. So you weren't getting the poor, you weren't getting women who were veiled, because they wanted Ahmadinejad, they didn't want a reformist. And that Green Revolution, again, was shut down. Women, men were literally gunned down in the streets, etc. Then you had other revolutions, and this was due to economic hardship. 2017, 2019, even one in 2020. And this was now the difference, was that unlike the Green Revolution, where it was upper middle class, youth, educated, this is mostly economic hardship. So it was working class people, and you did not have the upper middle class who was joining this. So you had a lot of disparate groups and disparate types of protests. What makes this protest so different is that you have people from all economic backgrounds, men and women, religious and not religious, people from the countryside and people from the cities, Kurdish, Shia, etc. I haven't seen anything about the Jews being out there, but of course, Jews would probably not be out there. Iran has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel in the Middle East, but they would never, I can't say, but they wouldn't put themselves out there like that, because the consequences are huge for them. And what we're also seeing is that the protests are also taking place in religious cities such as Mashhad and Qom. Mashhad is a very religious city and important city for Shia Muslims. They believe their ninth Imam Reza was buried there. He is buried there. If you know Iranian history, Mashhadi Jews were forced to convert there. It's a very, very religious and sacred place. And then Qom would be equivalent to Jerusalem for the Shia Muslims. That is where they have all of the seminaries where you go to be an imam, and you are literally seeing women from these areas, Mashhad and Qom, who are protesting. Students are a huge part of the protest. You had 420 city and university protest gatherings in 112 cities and 70 universities. And there's no signs of abating. You have the Minister of Education going to talk to these students. They're shutting him down. They're kicking him out. And as I mentioned, this is the boldest challenge to the regime since 1979. Who are these students? They're calling themselves Javaneh Tehran, the Tehran youth, but it's really taking place all over the country. Thousands of protesters, several cities on Saturdays, Wednesdays, through social media. They are protesting, and they want the internet, and they want people to see it. This is also a huge thing. Oil and petrochemical workers have gone on strike. This is the backbone of the Iranian government and the Iranian regime. What we're seeing is strikes are taking place all over the country in oil, gas, and steel sectors. And this has the potential to ultimately cripple Iran's economy and regime. So far, the regime has already arrested 250 workers. Their bosses are saying, no, 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 they're not protesting the regime. It's just a conversation we're having with them, because of work and things like that. It is all about the regime and wanting to bring the regime down. This was the impetus. I mean, this was a turning point for kicking the Shah out of power. So this has major potential. And remember, this is the backbone of the Iranian regime. This is how they make their money, and this is how they fund proxy wars all over the Middle East and Central and South America. The regime said, if you are going to strike, we're going to bring in Chinese workers. And that's a huge issue because China and Russia do support the regime. And the strikes will reduce production, as I mentioned, of oil, gas, and other petrochemicals, which will really backfire against the regime also because it's going to cause higher prices and more people are going to come out into the streets, even lower socioeconomic because of that. So again, showing you this was Tehran in September 2020, just last month, and it really turned into a huge thing. And the regime keeps saying it's just America or Israel funding this, but as we know, it's not. Okay, suggestions on what can be done. This is what everyone asks me. This is not me personally. These are just from all over that I took, and I'd love to have this conversation in terms of questions, what can be done, because there's not that much that can be done. Number one, when asked Iranians, especially Iranians living in the country, what can be done, they said, show us support. The solidarity rallies all over the world are really important to us. Keep us in the news. Don't let this be something that is in and out of the news cycle. Constantly, keep this in there, especially as we are dealing with day 40, especially as they are shutting down the internet. Another thing, support internet access. I literally had to write this down because I don't even understand what this means, but to license SpaceX Starlink satellite to operate in Iran means that Iranian voices could be heard and amplified. I know SpaceX, for example, is in the Ukraine. So this is the way that they could keep the internet going when the government is shutting it down. So people are aware of the human rights violations. People are asking the West, led by President Biden, to pressure the United Nations Security Council. In my world, I call the United Nations the useless nations because of the human rights violations that they completely ignore, and to push the UN to investigate the regime's crimes against humanity. People believe President Biden must mobilize the international community to convene a special session on the UN Human Rights Council to address what Iran is doing in the deadly crackdown. And this is one of the many reasons why I refer to the United Nations as useless nations. Iran is still on the UN's Commission on the Status of Women, which is insanity that it was ever allowed to be on that and that it is still on that. Iranians want President Biden to create an advisor, a special envoy on Iran to counsel him, and not someone from the NIAC. The NIAC is basically a lobby group in DC, in the Beltway, which represents the Iranian expat voice, but Iranians believe that it's basically a cover for the regime. So many Iranian protesters do not recognize NIC as being legitimate. So they're saying is you need to get scholars, protesters, expats living abroad, or those who just escaped Iran to be in Biden's ears. People believe Biden should shut down nuclear negotiations with Iran. I work for American Jewish Committee, that they definitely have that belief, and they should not legitimize a regime that is literally gunning down its own population. Sorry, I wrote that again. Just like what's going on with Russian children's oligarchs and families is they should be sent back to Iran. They are sitting in our universities abroad. They are living a really good life, and people believe that there should be consequences for these oligarchs of Iran. Britain, the US, and Canada imposed sanctions on senior figures in Iran's morality police, the ones who are literally beating up on people and killing them. And they would like Britain, US, and Canada to also expand that to EU and other countries. So we're done with this. I told you I'll finish soon so we could actually get to the questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soomekh. I want to just remind everybody before I ask the first question that if you have a question that you would like to be posed to Dr. Soomekh, please put it in the chat, send it to us, and Cantor Rafii and I will glean through the questions and select questions that that should be asked during the conversation. So I want to start, maybe it's because I'm a rabbi, or maybe because Jewish community is so important to me, just to focus in kind of on a micro lens on the Jewish community in Iran, just for a brief moment. I mean, I'm surrounded with family friends who are now mostly second generation Iranian Jews living here in Los Angeles. I'm thrilled to be partnered with one in a professional sense at the synagogue. And when we look at the Iranian community, the Iranian Jewish community, what impact does it have on them? How are they living through this? And is there a prospect of regime change promising for their future, or is what's promising for their future to get them out? And is there, I know I'm posing a lot of different, is there a kind of a unified effort that perhaps is necessary here in Los Angeles or around the country to rescue Iranian Jews at this point, in the same way that we did for refuseniks, in the same way that Israel mobilized for Ukraine? And if not, why not?
It's a great question. Rabbi Lebovitz, they don't want to come out. They have had the option to come out for decades. They don't want to come out. And for a lot of them, it's, look, we've been there for 2,700 years. Come out, leave everything behind, like all of our families, Cantor Rafii's family, all of our families did. Leave everything behind, start all over again. And I start all over again. What am I going to do? I'm moving to LA. I move into a tiny little apartment. Who's going to marry my daughter? We don't have money. We don't know anyone. So what happened was, my family, for example, left in 78. We saw the writing on the wall. We were always going to come out. We lived in America before. So my parents went back, and then they realized we need to go. But a lot of Jewish families stayed because they were in such denial that their Paris of the Middle East, when that's what, Tehran was at that time, the Paris of the Middle East, and the Shah had the most amount of weapons from the United States outside of nuclear weapons than any person in the world. So they couldn't believe that the secular Shah with the Savak, the secret police, and his army and all of this US weapons, that his regime, I mean, the CIA and MI6 was clueless to all of this, that this regime was going to collapse. So imagine if you are a Jew, you didn't think this regime was going to collapse. You couldn't believe that a man with a beard down to his knee, living in a Paris suburb because he got kicked out by the Shah, went to Iraq, got kicked out by Saddam Hussein, was going to come in and start this revolution. So they thought 1 year, 2 year, and then 43 plus years later. It wasn't really. And remember how I brought up the Iran-Iraq war. It wasn't until Khomeini turned to Jewish families, because at first it was just Shia families, but Jewish families, and said, your kids now have to go into the army, and now they have to be shaheeds, martyrs, where, the boys are going to get their detonated. And by the way, here's the key. And that's when Hayas stepped in. And Jews and Khomeini didn't want the Jewish families to leave at this point. They needed bodies, to stay in Iran and fight this war. By the way, Saddam Hussein by 1982 waved his flag and said, I'm done. I want to get out of this. Khomeini was the one who said, no, I want to continue going because Iraq has a large Shia population, and he wanted to take over Iraq and turn it Shia, not Sunni. So that's how you started getting families. And if you look, when they say, oh, I lived in Italy for a little, I lived in Switzerland, and then I came to America, it was because Hayas put them there. By the way, that's also how you get a lot of Chabad Iranians, is because they went to these countries. They lived there for a couple of months, a year, till they were able to come there. And then Chabad was the one who was saying, come to Shabbat dinners, let us teach you the, Ashkenazi Russian way of practicing. And so you wonder, well, how do you get Persian Chabad? This is how it started. But we still have large numbers who live there. And Israel has said, come, we will help you. Hayas has said, come, we will help you. The Iranian Jewish Federation, they don't want to come. They have a life there. And as long as, and this is important, you could be Jewish in Iran, you can't be a Zionist. As long as they don't show support for the state of Israel, from what we understand and from what we get, life is good. And so I know people whose dads come back and forth, and they say it's fine. So they don't want to be, quote unquote, safe like Ukrainian, Russian, Jews, et cetera, because they don't feel like they have to. Would it be easier for us if they were out of there? Absolutely, because then it makes negotiations, especially from Israel's perspective, from Jewish organizations, a lot easier. So how is life there for them? We don't know. And it's to their safety that we don't know. They don't talk to the press. They don't, again, it is, we just keep our mouths shut, because at any point, let's say you have a rival in business who wants your business out and you're Jewish, all they have to do is go to the Revolutionary Guard and say, so-and-so Cohen is a spy for Israel. They're in Ivan prison, and that's it. There's no due process of law. So it's, people have to be really careful, especially Iranian Jews who have family there, or any Iranian expats who have family that are there. They still have to be very careful, because what they say could affect their families back home.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soomekh, for an incredible presentation. The question that I have for you is, of course, prophecy is a part of Jewish history. We can't tell the future at this moment, but what do you think? Do you think it will be different this time? Do you think the regime is going to change?
It's such a great question. People ask me all the time. I don't know how it will. I want to be positive about this. Some people say, why can't we just go and arm them? Arm who? We're going to go give 20-year-old girls, M16s and tell them to use it against this regime that has nuclear weapons, that has all the arms in the world. I mean, it would be a bloodbath. The reason why the Shah's regime collapsed was because the Shah left, and then the army threw down their guns. The reason why for a period of time, for example, in Egypt, this happened was because the people who were told to beat up on the protesters turned around and said to, the army, we don't want to do this anymore. So unless the men in the, in the besieged turn around and say, I don't want to beat up on these people, but then they don't need those men. What they bring in Hezbollah, they could bring in Hamas, they could bring in Shias from Iraq. All of these people are financially funded by Iran with the proxy wars. They have no skin in the game and probably zero emotion in what they're doing. So I would like to believe something could change. I just don't know how. I really don't know how. And the government makes way too much money to say, we're going to now drop and our billions of dollars we're going to let go of. And they are right. They could bring in Chinese workers to take, over the petrol and the oil fields. And they have enough Chinese or Russian workers who are probably willing to do that. So I don't want to be a pessimist, but I personally, and maybe someone knows better than I do. And remember, I'm a historian, so I'm not coming in from a army perspective or, as just all the research that I'm doing. I just don't know how this could happen. And by the way, Iranians are not asking us to, some maybe, they remember what happened with Operation Ajax when the CIA and MI6 came in. And, when Mossadegh took control as a prime minister, he kicked the Shah out. We came in and had a CIA coup. And Iranians still remember that. So they want us involved. They don't want us that involved. And some people say, well, let's bring in the son of the Shah. That's not what people want. I know in LA, especially amongst Iranian Jews, because I interviewed so many of them, the Shah is so romanticized. And I understand why. He brought freedom to the Jewish community. But Iranians what they want is a democracy. They don't want the king's son who has been living as an expat for 43 plus years to come in there. They don't want to say, yes, majesty. But that's not what they're looking for. They're not going from a theocracy to a secular, this guy hasn't been in there for decades. He doesn't know what's going on there. So the idea that the Pahlavis will come back in, that's not what Iran wants. And that's not what we really want from them, because monarchies aren't really great either in, the Middle East, North Africa, et cetera.
Thank you so much. That's really, so we have some questions that are being chatted. Rabbi Lebovitz, should I go ahead with some of these questions? Okay. So one of the questions is, there is a theory, there's a concept called fear societies that Natan Sharansky has written about, where he groups people into believers, dissidents, and double thinkers. And the person who asked this question was wondering if you're familiar with this and if this applies to Iran in the sense that the double thinkers say the mantra, but they don't really believe in it. The true believers are the believers and the dissidents are the ones. And so the questioner is asking, do you think that people who are doing the double thinkers are moving into the dissident phase more and more, and you're getting more people to turn. You were talking about how we have to get the Basij to basically put down their guns and say, we don't believe in this anymore. Do you think that's happening?
I have not seen it happening. I hope it happens, but these young men have a lot to lose and a lot to gain by working with the regime. Because remember, I mean, they weren't alive, but their parents' generation were told by the secular regime of the Shah, of the Pahlavis, that because they're religious, they are, again, that Farsi word, Cantor Rafii, that, dahati, like ghetto, not important, not sophisticated. So they are probably coming in from the countryside, looking at these educated young girls who are secular in their eyes and, dealing with West toxification. That's a term that Khomeini made really famous, and probably, brainwashed in a sense. I would hope they would turn against the regime, but they have way too much to lose if they do. And they lose their power. They have a lot of power. And this is why so many religious people supported Khomeini, was because he took power out of the hands of the secular, out of the educated, and put it into the people who were religious, and said, for decades, you were told you were, ghetto, not important, not educated, dahati. And now I'm giving you all the power, and I'm giving you the homes of the people who've just escaped, the clothing, all of this stuff. So I would like to think they would turn against the regime. I just don't. I think they have a lot to lose if they do. And remember, the only way that they're able to mobilize and get higher and higher in society is through the Basij.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Soomekh. So I'm going to ask this from Ashkenazic, Chicago, didn't grow up around Persian people perspective, okay? We all have Ashkenazic Chicago connections here on the panel, which is wonderful. So a lot of times in synagogue over the last, let's say, decade, somebody walks into synagogue and they're wearing, Cantor Rafii and I have talked about this at length, somebody's wearing a pin of the flag of Iran in synagogue. And as an ardent Zionist and a supporter of Israel, that pin, I mean, from the AJC perspective, that pin is like a dog whistle for like everything that seems wrong with the world that in terms of what it is that we support, values, everything. And all of a sudden there's a groundswell during this protest and during all of the violence amongst the Jewish community to support the people of Iran in this moment. And my question is really about the relationship, to explain we have a lot of Ashkenazic community members here in the program, and I'm really happy to see them here, because this isn't solely an issue for the Iranian Jewish community or the Iranian community here in Los Angeles. It's when there's a violation of human rights, when there's bloodshed in the streets and on the news every single night, it's an issue for all of us. Why is this such a complicated issue for Iranians and Iranian Jews living here in this country, who have tasted freedom and enjoyed freedom and become American? Why do they look at Iran differently than I look back at Poland or Czechoslovakia, or the places where my grandparents were escaped and ran out of after the Shoah? And why is it now that this is such a moment for second generation Iranian Jews to look back at Iran and feel connected?
It's a great question. First of all, Rabbi Lebovitz, I want to ask you, the pin, it's most likely not the pin of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the pin of the Pahlavis, correct?
So I have to tell you, in all honesty, I don't know the difference between all the pins.
So I will tell you it is. And I see as Cantor Rafii's mother agreeing with me, because no Iranian Jew would ever, I mean, I don't want to, we're not in mono, but 99.9% of us would never wear a pin of the Islamic Republic of Iran. What they're wearing is the pin of the Pahlavi regime, the regime that in 1950 accepted Israel's right to exist, the regime that would allow El Al to fly in and out of Tehran Tehran airport, the regime that had a great relationship with Chaim Weizmann, the regime that literally brought in Israelis in the moshavs, etc., to come to Israel. I mean, at one point, Tehran had so many Israelis Why? Because the Shah said, teach us your agriculture. You guys are doing so well. Teach us what you're doing. The regime that sent doctors and nurses from Iran to Haifa or to Jerusalem, to Hadassah hospitals to learn and come back. So this was a regime that had a great relationship with Iran. And by the way, when the Arabs were not selling oil, there was a pipeline going from the Straits of Tiran right into Haifa. So this is
all of that is true. And also, as I read history about the Iranian regime before Khomeini, there was also terrible anti-Semitism that was rampant through the country, even during the heyday of the Shah, even during the days of Paris in Iran, right? There was terrible anti-Semitism.
It depends on where you lived. If you were out in the cities where there were smaller Jewish populations, yes. But if you were living in Tehran, especially like northern Tehran, you became upper middle class, your kids were going to Jewish day schools, and there wasn't. But then again, we have to remember that the reason why Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came into power was because his father, Reza Pahlavi, took the side of the Nazis like everyone else in the Middle East did, because you had the British and the Russians taking Iranian oil, and the Nazis came in and said, we're going to put a stop to that. So, so yes, and I always compare it to Europe, where you had the German Jews living in the heyday before the Holocaust, but there was still always that inherent anti-Semitism there. It's been there since the 16th century with Shia, the Safavid dynasty coming into power. But nevertheless, life was pretty good, and that is why people would wear that pin. It's the pin of the Pahlavi regime that brought the Jews out of the mahallahs, the Jewish ghettos, that told them you are no longer najas, ritually impure, now come. And this is when they became upper middle class. Yes, even dealing with anti-Semitism, because there was only a limit to how far they could go, it was still a pretty good life. And how do we know this? Look at the fact that you had over 850,000 Jews from the Arab world in North Africa kicked out, or voluntarily, because life was so difficult for them, go to Israel. You didn't have that with Iranian Jews. You did for the ones who are hardcore Zionists, or the ones who are still like, financially not, they went to Israel. But for the most, you didn't have this mass exodus of Persian Jews because life was really good for them. So that's the pin that you are seeing. And I think the reason why people are so emotional now about all of this is because Iranian Jews recognize, because they know the Iranian people are different than the government that represents them. And when you know Iranians as you do, we are warm, we are loving, we love to dance, we love to eat. And then you look at the regime and you look at these mullahs who don't smile, and you look at the women who support them in these black cloaks. And it's nothing, it has nothing to do with the culture, et cetera. And I think it really hit home, because I think people really hope, if there's a regime change, we would have a chance. I don't think anyone's thinking I'm going to go back and move to Iran. But yeah, I mean, I know I would, and I'm sure Cantor Rafii would. We would love to go back and see where our grandparents are from and where our parents are from. And, it's our history and it's our culture. But we've had to, get another identity, and it's America and it's Israel, and we're all Zionists, and Israel's our spiritual home. But at the end of the day, we come home, and on Shabbats, we're eating Persian food and we're speaking the Persian language. And as much as we relate to the Ashkenazi community, et cetera, or the non-Persian community, we're still, a very insular community. And my gosh, I lived in India. I know what the streets of Bombay smell like. I have no idea what Tehran looks like. And I have spent my life writing about this country. And it's, we hope to God one day this could happen. But, I think that's why with these human rights violations, and it's hard. I mean, I've seen posts all over with the anti-Semitism taking place. To be an Iranian Jew right now is exhausting. You have anti-Semitism that you relate to as a Jew, and then you're literally watching people, again, if I was in Iran, if Cantor Rafii was in Iran, we would probably be out on the streets beaten up too. So we could really relate to that.
Thank you for answering. And I asked it with the utmost respect, of course. Go ahead, Cantor Rafii.
Yeah, a follow-up question from an attendee about that. Why do you, for example, we were talking about, Rabbi Lebovitz was mentioning, like, we have, Jews from Poland and Germany who don't look fondly upon Germany and Poland the way that Persian Iranian Jews do. So why specifically do Iranian Jews, like, was there point of time where Germany and Poland kind of elevated the Jews the same way that Iran did. I imagine they were assimilated in the culture and really,
Yeah.
So why is there this sense of fondness towards towards Iran among Persian Jews that isn't necessarily shared by Ashkenazic Jews towards their former lands?
Well, one, I can't speak obviously on behalf of the Ashkenazi community, but as we're seeing, and as I mentioned, this is a generation that did not want the Islamic regime. This is a generation that was not responsible for what the Islamic regime has done. This is a generation that probably would tell you they don't want to chant death to Israel and annihilate Israel. This is a generation that is telling us we don't want our money going to Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and other terrorist factions. This is not what we care about. And so there's that empathy when we're seeing that. And I think that's what we're seeing is, it's young men and women literally being beaten up in the streets, trying to overthrow a regime that wants to annihilate our spiritual home and refers to Israel as a little Satan, in America, our actual home as a big Satan. So I think there's a lot of empathy with that and a lot of hope. I mean, look, the difference is you could be a Polish Jew and yes, your family, I mean, it's horrific what the Polish Jewish community went through. And I see myself in that pain. I don't differentiate it because I was born in Iran. What happened to the Polish Jewish community happened to me and to my family in that sense, because we're one big family. But you could also go back to Poland and you could see all of that. And I think there's this sense of there's that trauma, but then you could go and you could face the trauma, and that helps with the psyche. We have never gone back. And at this point, we could never go back. And so I think we are always living in that traumatic sense, and we have nothing to help us really, to get over it. As my mom and dad would say, if I go back there, I don't know a single person. I wouldn't even be able to find our house. All the street names have been renamed to names of martyrs who died. So we don't, and maybe this helps with, again, I can't talk on behalf of the Ashkenazi community. At least, I mean, Poland has been horrible with recognizing what they've done and just are blaming it on, on the Germans. But there is, for example, with Germany, this sense of we did this and we are responsible, where obviously with the Iranian regime, we're not getting any of that. So, I don't know. Again, we're not a monolithic community so this is just my own feelings. And I don't know if other people within the Persian Jewish community would agree or not, but it really has brought up a lot of emotions, very different than 2009, because remember, 2009 didn't say overthrow the government. It's saying we want our voices, our vote to count. This is literally saying we have had enough of the human rights violations and we want to overthrow the government. And for us, that's like a breath of fresh air. Maybe one day we could go back there to visit at least.
So Dr. Soomekh, I can tell you that just to kind of put a wrap on this Ashkenazic Persian conversation, one of the most beautiful things that have happened at Valley Beth Shalom during Shabbat services is when I'm standing on the bima and Cantor Rafii and I are leading, and I look over to the left part of the left section by the door, and I see Cantor Rafii's parents sitting right by my parents, and think about where these two couples, where their backgrounds have no crossover whatsoever for thousands of years, and brought together for Shabbat services at VBS. It's really a beautiful thing. I'm going to ask you one more question about, and I'm going to ask you to predict the future. Cantor Rafii brought up prophecy before, so I'm not going to put you on the spot in the role of Isaiah or Jeremiah. But you do a lot of work in sociology. You do a lot of work in politics of the moment, the Middle East, AJC. Do you foresee the American government, military getting involved in this conflict? Because by and large, America has really not been involved in this, even in the way that we've kind of meddled and not been directly involved in Ukraine. We've still had a hand in what's going on there. But do you foresee the United States of America getting involved to a greater extent in what's going on in Iran?
I know Jake Sullivan just talked about the fact that Obama said one of his biggest regrets was not supporting the Iranians more in 2009. And he said he did this was because he he was hearing from Iranians that it has to be more organic, and from them. And of course, he had, Operation Ajax in the back of his head, and the CIA, et cetera. I don't know. I mean, I wish I could say, I don't know. I mean, we have Middle East fatigue, right? We just came out of Afghanistan, even though that's Central Asia, we're bringing people out of Iraq. So I don't know. And it's easy because how many of us have family in the military in LA? It's not like a large Jewish community that's going into the military. So it's not our boys and girls who are going to have to go back there. So I don't know. It would be not easy. It would not be easy if we, we literally just came out of Afghanistan and Iraq. So, how does it look on the world stage that we're trying to get another regime change, even though the people want it? I just don't know. I wish the UN would do more, but the UN is, as I mentioned, just kind of useless at this point. Sanctions are useless because, as we've seen, it's really just hurting the everyday people. The mullahs with their billions aren't affected by this, nor are their families. I don't know. I don't envy Biden or any president who would have to make this decision. So, and we're trying to pivot more to Asia and look to Asia, but China's not doing us any favors. We're seeing Iranian drones in Russia used against Ukraine. So I think I would like to say diplomacy is a way, but then again, the mullahs are making billions of dollars. I can't imagine what's going to bring this regime down unless it is literally like going in with tanks and stuff. But America has those images of what happened in Iraq, and it wasn't easy, and just like what happened in Iraq, all of a sudden, Iran could bring in Hezbollah, could bring in Hamas, could bring in all of the, Shias coming out of Iraq, and they're going to easily fight with the Americans. So it's not going to be in and out like we thought Iraq was going to be. And the next thing we know, over a decade more, we're still there. So I don't know. In a perfect world, I would say, yeah, let's go in there, get them out, and that's it. But as we saw, it's not that easy. That mission accomplished that we remember Bush saying, that wasn't a mission accomplished.
It was very premature, and
yeah.
And now we can judge it that it was actually wrong.
And only brought in Shia hegemony into Iraq.
Right. The mission accomplished statement was wrong.
Right.
I think also the media coverage represents the appetite that the American public has for the story. So when you compare it to the media coverage given to Ukraine as opposed to given to Iran, it just reflects the appetite that the American public has for this narrative as opposed to that narrative.
Right.
Dr. Soomekh, I want to be conscious of your time and the time of everyone who has joined us this evening. I want to thank Cantor Rafii for bringing you to this community. I want to thank you for joining Valley Beth Shalom this evening for this program. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us. We had over 60 people participating on Zoom. And I want to thank you for your patience in terms of entering your questions into the chat. And I want to thank you for supporting this program. And it's taken all Jewish organizations a moment to figure out how to address what's going on in the news and how to support with the nuance that Dr. Soomekh described this evening. And it takes the type of academia, intelligence, experience in dealing with the matters to find the right people to convey those kinds of ideas. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you at Valley Beth Shalom.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for having me.